There are many areas where there are potential market failures, in which case the government has to intervene. The point is that government should not be intervening, in unnecessarily. And I'll give you an example. Agriculture is actually a very good example where there's been needless intervention. This blazer, your t-shirt could be the producer of these, infrastructure, cameras, etc. They all can go and sell their produce wherever they want.
Correct.
Is that freedom allowed to the farmer? Yes. No. The APMC Act basically says that you can go and sell only in a particular. The state of the small farmer, the small marginal farmer, is basically not very good. In fact, the farm bills actually were an effort to really help the small farmers. Milton Friedman, in the 1950s, he was invited by the then government to actually, basically give advice to the Planning Commission. Okay. And his simple piece of advice was that you are a labor-rich country. Labor is a comparative advantage of yours. Your economic model should be one that should be utilizing that, and we did exactly the opposite. Up until 1991, our economic model was so deeply flawed.
Chidambaram said that what's the big deal about getting to 3 trillion or 5 trillion? India will inevitably get there. Is that how countries behave? They inevitably grow?
No. Him having been the finance minister for on multiple occasions, I'm sure knows this data. It's not obvious at all. And in the book, for instance, I've written a chapter on the middle income trap. Growth requires hard work, good policies. Those that basically who are incorrigibly critical end up bringing up all these concerns when good things are happening, but when bad things are happening, then they basically forget about all this.
Namaste, welcome to another edition of Sangam Talks Business with me. Today I have the former Chief Economic Advisor, Professor K.V. Subramanian, who's written this book, and he's all over social media, all over YouTube, with TV channels, interviews, and a lot of that. So I'm also joining the gang, Behti Ganga mein haath dho raha hu while he's here. So, sir, I just saw a few interviews, and let me begin actually by saying that not many people in positions of high positions such as yourself, or even in business, have any vulnerability. I saw in one of your interview at Kellogg India Business Conference, when you were introducing yourself, you talked about your background, low middle income background, and saying that that you were nervous about whether you would be classified as the worst chief economic advisor, and that you were nervous and you'd go back and read, and so on and so forth. It was lovely hearing that. Personally, for me,
my pleasure.
I've run a business like that, with vulnerability as one of the values.
So actually, one of the things that I've tried to live is, to be authentic.
Yes.
Many times when one gets the privilege of being in the public eye, one tries to put on a certain dimension, this is how I should appear. But I'm actually quite comfortable, being who I am. And I've always believed that as human beings, we're all imperfect, striving for perfection, but certainly not perfect. And I mean, now that I've spent at least half a century on this planet, I can say with conviction that every human being, irrespective of whatever he or she achieves, does go through the same, I'm sure even the most accomplished individual, even if one were to have, interviewed an Einstein or an Isaac Newton, they would have also have had periods of self-doubt, that's very human in some sense, and how we overcome that is what I think is important. Sure. But I don't think we should deny that, because, and the reason I also, apart from being authentic, I also try to speak about this is because many times when one, sort of is privileged to get some success, people mark you out as saying, oh, this person is different, or, and that can sort of create barriers, I think the belief that one can, through hard work, through sincere effort, one can also achieve, that belief is important. And I think being able to relate with people that they all went through the same kind of travails that a youngster will go through is very important actually.
And it's very inspiring. It gives,
thanks so much.
Yeah, it gives inspiration. It also tells people that I'm not the only one going through all this.
Yeah,
People in success have gone through this.
Indeed. And in fact, actually, yesterday I was having a conversation with my younger brother, who's also a professor at the Indian School of Business, and we were talking about.
You had to become a doctor, by the way. But you had to become an engineer. He had to become.
No, he actually, but he also then became an engineer only. So he. Like me, he followed me 2 years later to IIT Kanpur, same electrical engineering, same then IIM Ahmedabad, and he did his PhD and as a professor at. We were talking about the quota factory, and IIT, not the UPSC, the IIT JEE. And one of the things that I've actually, when I've believed is that the IIT JEE examination is very difficult because while the level of competition is like as tough as, let's say, the UPSC, but you have to do it when you are far younger and being able to handle those stresses, etc. And so, and one of the things I was mentioning is that because sort of we ended up doing well in those examinations, some of the struggles oftentimes we don't remember as well. But watching the quota factory, and especially seeing some of the examinations and the marks, then I was reminded of the times when I myself felt self-doubt as well. I was mentioning to him yesterday when there used to be some topics. I used to, for instance, be not very good at mechanics initially, and used to not do very well. And I was mentioning to him when the teacher would give out the marks for, let's say, that entire class, I would remember that I was not able to focus as well in the class because just, sort of thinking about why, and the cell, will I be able to make it, that kind of those questions. So I think it is just important that people see that, everyone goes through these periods, and I think that's incredibly important.
And when you found success, you talk about it, so it just motivates others. Thank you so much for doing that.
Sure.
So I want to come to the first question, opening question here. P. Chidambaram said that what's the big deal about getting to 3 trillion or 5 trillion? India will inevitably get there. Why this focus? Is that how countries behave? They inevitably grow?
No. I think him having been the finance minister for on multiple occasions, I'm sure knows this data.
Okay.
But if you look at, for instance, the BRICS countries, at a point in time, they were actually talked about, this inevitability of growth was talked about for BRICS countries. Okay. But of which, if you look at, countries like Brazil, South Africa, and Russia have actually gone through output declines. So, it's not obvious at all that there is.
Is it a matter of time that instead of getting there in 5 years, 10 years, it will take 20 years? But
no, actually, even that is not true. That is not true because, and in the book, for instance, I've written a chapter on the middle income trap. There is a large literature that basically, talks about how many countries remain stuck in the middle income trap. Latin American countries, South Africa. So it is, growth requires hard work, good policies. There is no inevitability of growth. Anybody who actually, makes it seem as if growth is inevitable, either is basically does not know the evidence, or knows the evidence and yet is actually, portraying it in a manner which is less than true. Less than true. So I think it needs to be told in categorical terms that those who basically make this growth seem as if it is something that is inevitable, it isn't. In fact, why go and look at any other country? Look at India itself. Actually, I mean, when I took over as the chief economic advisor, growth, my first press conference growth was 5.3%, and that was because of the overhang of the financial sector problem. So, and at that time, some of the people were talking about how, India is hitting the middle income trap, and so at that time, obviously, there was no inevitability of growth. So I think this also helps me highlight a point, right, which is that, those that basically sort of who are incorrigibly critical end up, bringing up all these concerns when good things are happening, But when bad things are happening, then they basically forget about all this stuff. So I think there's a certain deliberate asymmetry in the commentary that comes out of some of these commentators, which common people need to understand. And I think also point out that you can't have your cake and eat it too, or you can't be basically heads I win, tails you lose, that kind of commentary.
Cool, thank you. So and then is this whole thing about focus on manufacturing, electronics manufacturing or semiconductor manufacturing. Firstly, in your mind, do you create a difference, or would you bucket, or does the government, buckets everything as the same when it has the PLI schemes, electronics, semiconductors and all? And related question to that is that in that interview at Kellogg's, Raghuram Rajan actually mentioned that that why is this government focusing so much on manufacturing? You're spending $10 billion, you route that to universities, focus on fundamentals. Honestly, I was a little confused because there was a lot of focus on security guards, for example, them coming up. I was like, okay, it was a little disconcerting for me that are we only going to look at, is services going to be driven by, say, for example, security guards and continue to focus on services? You mentioned that failure of manufacturing, and I quote you, failure of manufacturing has been a policy failure of the government.
Of not this government, actually. I made that very clear.
No, you were actually probably talking about earlier governments.
Yes. I think it's important to understand that whenever one talks about India having not utilized the manufacturing growth or having missed the manufacturing bus, as quote unquote commentators talk about, I think it is equally important to then talk about the reasons why that happened. Because in my opinion, it's not rocket science that when you look at a manufacturing sector firm, what does it need? A manufacturing firm needs land, needs labor, it needs capital, it needs power. Typically, economists will not put that as a factor of production. That's an important input. Those in business will definitely acknowledge that. Similarly, it needs to transport its products, to basically ports, and if it has to export, or even domestically as well. So logistics is important. And finally, another aspect that is really critical is scale. Because when you have that appropriate scale, you're able to spread your fixed costs over a larger denominator, and that reduces your average costs. Okay. And when your average costs are lower, then you actually can compete better, whether it is from imports that are coming in from outside, or when you are exporting to other countries yourself, right? Now the simple fact is that while we actually deregulated some part of our product markets in 1991, Dr. Arvind Panagaria, for instance, says that even some of the small scale industries, etc., were not deregulated, and he's right about that. When it comes to factor markets, we have just not deregulated our factor markets. I mean, this is basically jargon for markets for factors of production like land, labor, capital, etc. These continue to be very, very distorted, and it is basically the role of policy to ensure that these markets become efficient by a lot of the socialist era residue that maybe residue is not the right word, actually it's a remnant that is there. So those have not been dismantled at all. Land markets are very distorted, labor markets. Look, the firm that I now I'm associated with International Monetary Fund, it's a multinational institution. In 1991, as part of its aid program for India, at that time actually had talked about labor laws as an important reform, and here we are 33 years later, we're still talking about labor reform. Of course, the bill has been passed for wage code, but waiting for the the subordinate legislation to be passed. So now so many governments have come, right, in this period, but none of them have actually talked about. In fact, for instance, during the 2004 to 2014 period, there wasn't even a conversation on labor laws, that these are important, and that was the period where the global economy was doing very well. We could have, for instance, grown like China if we had reformed these factors of production. We did not, and these are aspects that need to be acknowledged. I think as an economist, I actually would like to help my viewers understand the full picture rather than just basically giving deliberately incomplete pictures.
Land reforms basically means ability to acquire land. Yes.
Yes, at reasonable prices.
Reasonable prices.
At reasonable prices. Yes. You know, if you, for instance, are going to impose a lot of restrictions, then obviously, you know, compared to demand, supply gets much lower, and then prices go up. And you know, so effectively, what's happening is for a you know, manufacturing entrepreneur, somebody who wants to start a manufacturing firm, he or she faces anywhere between 15 to 20% higher costs on each one of these inputs that I talked about, and when you accumulate them together, you know, you're not being competitive, right? So it is important to acknowledge, and you know, in the same breath, let me also say that while there's been work done by this government in the last, there's still a lot more work to be done, you know, on manufacturing. So on manufacturing, whenever somebody says we've missed the manufacturing bus, I actually push them, I would like to push them to say also, you know, analyze why. I mean, as economists, we have to actually talk about that, and then being able to fix those policy failures is what will enable us to.
They seem to take a stand that it's not important to fix this at all.
No, that I completely disagree. And actually in the book, you know, I cover this in great detail. Let me explain to you why. You know, for one, we are a young population, and you know, we need jobs. And in the book, I actually talk about as well how jobs, you know, in the manufacturing sector, not only do they reduce uncertainty income, because think about it, when you have a formal sector job, you know that you will get an income every month, right? And that reduces uncertainty significantly. Correct. And whether it's consumption or investment, you know, more often than not, it reduces far more due to uncertainty. If you, for instance, think that tomorrow's, let's say, you know, or next month's salary is, you know, it may not come, you're not going to go and buy a durable good, maybe a car, or you know, and in contrast, if you know that you have a steady stream of income that is going to come, that you will basically go and, you know, buy, and so uncertainty really has this impact. And you know, when you have a formal sector job, you do not face that uncertainty. So that is really important for consumption. But more importantly, from a social and economic inclusion perspective, jobs are really critical. You know, I can't do better than talking about my own experience. If my father, as you said, you know, I come from a lower middle class background. If he did not have that job, you know, in the Indian Railways, there's no way he would have been able to educate me and my brother. And if you look at just that formal sector job has basically, you know, helped maybe generations, right?
Sure, but that's probably the point that Raghuram Rajan seems to be making, that focus, why give PLI scheme discounts, subsidies of $10 billion, route them to education institutes, or, you know, the highest growth sector, for example, he talked about in that interview is security guards rising. So get them to the market, to cities, then their children. I mean, it feels like to me like a 30, 40, 50 year cycle of you're talking about, okay, we'll come up the...
No, actually, again, let me give you some, you know, data here, right? If you look at manufacturing sector growth just last year, 9.9%, you know, on a GDP growth of 8.2%.
And they keep talking about such growth being jobless growth.
That, which again, actually, I'll address that. I'll address that, sure. But you know, let me make sure that I cover this PLI, sure, you know, because it's an important point.
Yes.
See, I want to give a conceptual explanation, but I also want to actually, you know, put some data using, you know, PIB's, you know, reports on these, and these are themselves coming from Parliament questions that have been answered. So, for one, you know, why is the PLI scheme? You know, why was it designed? As I said, the current, you know, problems with manufacturing, or you know, in the past, have been because of policy, you know, not having done enough. Now, it is actually taking some years. It's not going to be 40 years, but it'll take a few years. But by that time, if we don't have domestic firms that can actually benefit from those policy reforms, then, you know, in a democracy, that's not going to be something that is going to be a good outcome. So you have to, you know, we academics can oftentimes, we can write papers basically, you know, one equilibrium versus the other, and you know, postulate equilibria. But in the real world, you have to lay out a bridge, yes, from the, you know, from the previous equilibrium to the current equilibrium, yeah. And that's what the PLI scheme is.
Nobody would come and manufacture. Basically,
yes,
nobody would, because you don't have land,
correct.
Logistics, your costs are very high.
Correct.
So you have to give subsidies.
You have to give. And here, actually, because it's a legitimate question to ask, you know, is the ROI on this, is it actually adequate? So let me give you some data. Sure. You know, if you look at the actual disbursements that have happened, there's been, the scheme has basically a certain outlay that's been provided. But what we have to look at, the actual money that's been spent is the actual disbursement.
Absolutely.
That is about 4,400 crores. On this 4,400 crores, what is the benefit that has come? So if you look at the data again, about 1 trillion of investment till November 2023 in manufacturing. Sales of about 8.6 trillion sales or revenue, and if you look at employment, actually about 6.7 lakh jobs have been created out of that, or 3.2 trillion exports. If let's say you don't want to get into these sort of macro numbers, let's just take a very simple, let's take Apple. Apple has benefited from the PLI scheme. Obviously, the entire 4,400 crores has not gone to Apple, only a small proportion.
Absolutely.
What is the job creation? Actually, 1.5 lakh jobs, direct jobs, just from Apple,
just
right?
Because of Apple.
Just because of Apple. And if you take, the indirect jobs that have been created, those are actually 3 lakhs. Now, and the second point, this is important. See, the disbursement or the what is actually invested as part of PLI is a one-time. Right, but the benefits you get actually, people who get that employment, they're going to get wages every year, right? So if you just leave alone the the 3 lakh indirect jobs that have been created, just the 1.5 lakh jobs that have been created in Apple. On average, this person would be earning at least 20,000 rupees. Put that together, you're basically looking at substantial amount, much more than what has been invested, and this will come. It'll be like an an annuity, right? If not a perpetuity, it'll not be in a perpetuity, but annuity over many years. So when you do this ROI calculation, as economists or as business people, we have to take into account that a one-time investment is basically of actual disbursed amount is leading to, I've only talked about the employment. What about the investment, the benefits that come and the spillover benefits, all those we've not even taken.
And the ecosystem of manufacturing that keeps building. There will be Indian entrepreneurs who will come up with doing all sorts of services, including security guards for Apple.
Yes, and that's the important part, right? Which is that there is enough and more evidence, in economics. There's a large literature that talks about how manufacturing sector growth is critical for many reasons. One additional reason that I want to, if for instance, and in Indian economy is going to rise, there'll be a middle class that will be created. This middle class will need basically phones, will need cameras, will need refrigerators, cars, and all those durable goods. If you're not going to produce them at home, obviously we'll have to import all of that. Absolutely. And that will have an impact on the external sector. Yes. So this is important, and we can't, and just learning from the previous experience when the taper tantrum, when we current account deficit touched close to 6%, when the Fed basically started tapering its interest rate, we actually started getting into real macro trouble, right? Yeah. So these are important ramifications that we must keep in mind, and not just that. If you also think about it from the perspective of manufacturing sector growth also helps, as they say, convergence. This I go back to your very first question that as I said when I responded to your question then as well, there is no unconditional convergence. Unconditional means, in software language, if you were to say that without any if-then statements. So convergence actually has some conditionalities. Sure. If a country does 1, 2, 3 things, then its GDP growth, its GDP grows, and thereby it's able to converge to basically the advanced economies. That's a phenomenon of now when commentators, like a former finance minister, makes it seem as if growth is inevitable. Growth is inevitable. What he's actually trying to, and he's sort of not being true to the data and the evidence by saying that, could do whatever even if you do nothing, in unconditional convergence, which is not the case. The evidence in economics is absolutely clear that convergence is conditional, not unconditional. And Danny Roderick at Harvard University and others have actually shown this clearly. Manufacturing sector growth is one of those key conditions for convergence. And that is why it is really critical. I've given you already 3 reasons. I said, we have a young population. We need to create jobs. Service sector growth, as also basically follows from manufacturing sector growth. We need basically, if we don't have this, the middle class will demand goods, which basically will have to be imported, and that'll have a problem on the on the external sector. And it is important for convergence. Yes. So, there are enough and more reasons why we should be investing in manufacturing, you know, and good economic logic, data driven reasons why we should be investing. I hope that the, you know, viewers actually listen to this, and you know, any incorrect notions that have been built are you know, are clarified.
But it makes common sense to me that unless you have manufacturing, if you keep investing in universities, which you should, absolutely no doubt about that, put another additional $10 billion in universities, for example.
No, see, let me here actually see on universities, and actually I've covered this as well, right? In the, you know, there's a chapter on education, there's a chapter on healthcare as well. Now, on healthcare, for instance, I would say that yes, more money needs to be put in, you know, and one of the important things there is the very first chart is that if the public spend, you know, on healthcare, and this is center and states together, if it increases to about 3% of GDP from the current about 1.5% of GDP, then out-of-pocket expenses decline significantly. Out-of-pocket expenses, I know the way to think about this is, you know, I've used this example from the Three Idiots movie, when you have, you know, all the three main characters go to Raju's house, and Raju's mom talks about how half of her salary goes into taking care of the ailing father. That is the reality. Now, you know, if you put more money in, and states here have to play a very critical role, because health is actually a state subject, you know, then it can reduce. So that's one area where funding is important. But education is an area where far more actually the, you know, increasing the bang for the buck, rather than putting in more money is really critical. And here I'm talking about school education in particular. You know, if you look at, for instance, the kind of governance that happens, you know, in the, you know, basically of the school system, that's an area that requires far more emphasis. Many times our teachers are basically sent for riff-raff jobs, and you know, they're not, you know, even good teachers and teachers who actually, they're not really getting to only teach, you know, which is their core activity, right? So these are aspects of governance. Similarly,
Abhiyan is in absolute shambles all over the country.
And not just that, if you take, for instance, you know, I'm a teacher myself. So when I look at, you know, teaching, right, to deliver good teaching, you know, a brilliant teacher is sufficient, is actually that really, you know, helps. But even a normal teacher can actually deliver very high quality teaching with additional support in the form of good teaching material, in the form of good pedagogical manuals. In other words, I'll give you, you know, a specific sort of a concrete example here, that if, let's say, I'm teaching a kid, you know, about squares, this is a maybe class 2 or class 3 kid, about squares of numbers, right? Many times, you know, nowadays Lego blocks, etc. there you can actually ask the kid to make a 3 square, put 3, you know, 3 blocks, basically 9 blocks, right? 3 on the length and 3 on the breadth, and thereby he or she is able to concretely understand this is a square, and you know, you count the number, you basically get, you know, 3 into 3 is 9, right? Now, the reason I bring up this example is because if you look at the way we all learn from the concrete to the abstract. That's the phenomenon of learning. And if you just reflect on the process, I mean, I'm going to use mathematics as an example itself. We first learn arithmetic, and then from arithmetic, then we basically are taught, we introduce algebra, you know, so x could be 1, 2, 3, anything, right? So that's basically, so from arithmetic, using the concrete arithmetic, we are then taught, you know, the abstraction of algebra. Right. And then with the concretization of, you know, algebra, then you see, oh, x can take 1, 2, 3, but it can also go maybe 1.1, 1.01, etc. That sets up basically for you to learn calculus. So this aspect is actually so critical to pedagogy. So if we can realize this and thereby have pedagogical manuals by this triad, which is actually the language of instruction, class and subject. In other words, for every language of instruction, for every, you know, class and for every subject, this is how we basically introduce the concept in this manner and then explain the concept in this manner. That can help a lot, because, you know, I mean, I'm saying this from practical experience. All of us did not become good teachers, you know, overnight. We basically sort of did apprenticeship over senior teachers, you know, and for instance, I was a teaching assistant to Raghu. You know, he's a very good teacher, and observing him, I actually learned like that. I observed others as well, right? So, but these can be codified, you know, and by codifying, you can make this process to be far more scalable, right? And that's what is required. The reason I'm saying this is that this sort of this trade-off, or the way it's put, that the money that is going into PLI, which actually, as I said, I gave you the figures, the investment is, is paying, it already paid off possibly. But even this sort of artificial trade-off, the money that could go into PLI could go into education, that is not speaking to the right problem, because the problem with education is not about the money that's going in, it's about how we are utilizing the money. And I think that's these are important aspects to understand.
Would you vouch for, this may be a little bit of sidetracking, but one of the agendas that we at Sangam Talks and all have been pushing for is the point that all Indian states need to teach higher education in non-English languages. In Tamil, in Malayalam, Bengali, we should be able to do engineering and masters in mathematics.
Yeah.
I don't know where.
So I've written a piece, in Times of India on this.
On this?
Yes, I think maybe about a year back, and I think there is a lot of evidence actually, across. This is an area, the well-researched area. There are lots of papers. In fact, I think one of for Professor Tarun Jain at IIM Ahmedabad, for instance, some of his research itself shows that it actually helps to learn in native languages conceptually, and I think, and if you look at other countries, maybe look at China, Japan, etc., they all actually learn in their native languages. It is, it is only in India we have this incredible fascination with English. And that's also because somehow, there's this, if you speak English, you're cool. If you're not able to speak English, you're uncool. I mean, I don't know why. It's just a language.
This is one big decolonization that we have to go undergo.
Not just that. If you're, somebody who's able to speak French, Francois is basically supposed to be really cool. I mean, our language, for God's sake, and yet we actually have. The more important thing is to be able to understand concepts, your depth of thinking. It's just language is just a way of communication. But how we have actually, and because of the way aspects that some of our elite have emphasized, that just being able to speak a language well actually is just taken as reflection of ability, even though these people may not have very deep thinking at all. Right?
And I can promise you that I've run a 600 people software company. Most project managers that I had to hire, and I've seen testimonials of other business leaders much bigger than me. Their whole problem is that we have English speaking project managers who basically know nothing about the job.
Exactly. See,
the only qualification is you speak English.
No, without getting into specifics, see, I've actually taught in the US. I've also taught in India, right? Many times people will ask me to they'll ask me to, can you compare and contrast how? It's not obvious that somebody who's able to speak a language very well can necessarily analyze things, can indulge in first principles thinking, can structure a problem, can actually come up with creative solutions. And yet I find actually people who don't necessarily speak English that well. I mean, I went to IIT, there are people who may know many who come who basically speak in Hindi, but they can analyze the problem really well, break it up into pieces. So this has been an extremely unfortunate thing in India that, the ability to speak English is taken to be reflection of ability. And actually, especially when I look at podcasts, I look at interviews, etc., I see a lot of people who are very flaky, who can speak, English maybe very well, but don't have the depth. So the important emphasis has to be on depth, and I think the quality of thinking, it's English or French or German or whatever, any of these, or for that matter, Tamil, Telugu, these are but languages. These are just ways of communication. I think that is the sooner our youngsters actually get over, this aspect, I think is really, I can tell you, I think the next generation that is coming in, I see some very good signs there. For instance, our generation, many of us, we are not so fascinated. We don't basically, I can tell you today I can speak English really well, but maybe 25 years back, I wasn't able to speak it as fluently. But that, I never took that as basically any reflection of my ability. My ability was a different dimension. I'd already done well in the IIT JEE actually, even though I was able to. So I think there's ample evidence of, and I think this is an aspect that culturally we need to progress and dismantle any notion that ability to speak English is is basically reflection of ability. It is not.
And once again, a little bit of sidetrack. I'm actually working with a lot of Ayurveda doctors in creating an Ayurveda fund, a business fund, 500 crores or whatever. We have ambitious goals, but prevention of disease, which is where Ayurveda operates, is actually a very important aspect. In the example you gave is if you work on prevention of disease,
Yes.
then you could not load the medical infrastructure with so much.
Indeed.
more money.
No, I mean, this is an area where I can speak for hours,
Okay.
just from personal experience, because, my father, my son, my mother, my brother, all of them have benefited from, I also have benefited from using, Ayurvedic medicines. See, I'll for want of time, I'll not go into too many examples, but let me just give you the example of my brother. And this is, actual, my brother, he used to be asthmatic. And at IIT Kanpur, there used to be a lot of problem of pollens, and he used to have very severe asthmatic. Come winter, come October, he had to get admitted. He would actually have to be pumped steroids, and within 2 years or 2-3 years of pumping of steroids, he he was walking like a 60-year-old, like a 60-year-old, right? And then some friend of mine actually. I don't now remember, actually this was must have been easily, I think 1996 or so. Some friend of mine mentioned that his 60-year-old or maybe 70-year-old grandmom actually took this fish medicine in Hyderabad, and she got basically cured. And then this friend was saying that, oh, your brother is young, if my grandmom who's gotten cured with, with basically, who's 65, 70, then your brother can definitely get cured. Now remember, we basically both of us engineers who actually, and first of all, I didn't believe, but then it's because it really sort of, the blinkers we had actually, those blinkers had to be broken to be able to, but then when he said it with so much conviction, then I said, why not try, right? And then I called up my brother and told him. He also first, in fact, he said, he sort of like mockingly said, you are advocating this, and then I told him, this friend of mine seemed so convinced, why didn't you go and try it? He went and tried it, and lo and behold, he's actually not only recovered fully, he's gone to Kailash and he's a full convert, right? Because he's seen this in personal life, and I've seen that. My dad actually is arthritis. My son used to have eczema, very bad eczema. Homeopathic, he's gotten cured. So so sometimes, for instance, when we have these intellectual discussions, people say, oh, these may be placebo effects. I tell them, as a parent or as a child or maybe as a brother, I don't care if it's placebo effect or treatment effect, as long as it gets cured, I'm happy actually. So this is an area I absolutely believe that there's enormous wealth here that can be, because I think.
So we'll send you a paper when we have our paper for increase in budgets on Ayurveda. So hopefully you can.
You're asking the wrong person.
No,
academics cannot fund stuff.
No, you can lobby with the government. Hopefully.
No, I think this government, of course, realizes understands the benefit. The Honorable Prime Minister himself actually understands these very well.
Okay, I want to come to this question about government intervening, and it's a sort of theoretical question, if you like. The government directing the economy, for example, saying that we want to now get into manufacturing. There is this whole volume of wealth of data around government not interfering in wherever the economy wants to go. Yeah, and you have a chapter here in your book which says, basically minimizing government and sort of increasing privatization. I mean, how do you do this balance? Where should the government come in? Where should the government not come in?
See, it's a very good question, because again, the answer here actually, as with a lot of economics, is it depends. Okay. And it depends on what, which is that in areas where private sector can basically manage on its own. In other words, what we economists call, there are no market failures. Market can function smoothly. There are no problems, or what we economists think about like asymmetric information, which is asymmetric information is the fact that I don't know enough about you, and vice versa, or that problem of asymmetry in information, or things like, for instance, markets are basically are incomplete, or there are many conditions. But in general, if you think about situations where markets are well functioning or can function, right, that is basically an area where the government does not have business being in business. Okay. That said, though, there are many areas where there are significant market failures, and these are sort of strategic sectors where you don't want to let the market be dominant. Defense is one example, and therefore in today's world, telecom is important, because so much of defense actually relies on telecom like that. And so now you would not basically let your for instance your national defense be done by the private sector, right? It is done by the military, by the defense forces, which actually is an arm of the government. So like that, there are many areas where there are potential market failures, in which case the government has to intervene. The point is that government should not be intervening in unnecessarily. And I'll give you an example. Agriculture is a very good example where there's been needless intervention.
May I insert a point here?
Yeah.
If we go back to Nehruvian ideas, actually we do not have manufacturing, perhaps also because the Nehruvian governments for decades intervened in not letting good manufacturing happen.
This is something we can talk for hours, but those were failures actually that there's not much of a point going into now. I will just suffice to and say that Milton Friedman, who's the doyen of University of Chicago in economics, in the 1950s, he was invited by the then government to basically give advice to the Planning Commission. And his simple piece of advice was that you are a labor-rich country. Labor is a comparative advantage of yours. So your business model, your economic model should be one that should be utilizing that. And we did exactly the opposite. I think Dr. Arvind Panagaria's work on this, and others actually, I think it's revealing that I think all one can say is up until 1991, our economic model was so deeply flawed that there isn't much to sort of to learn or pick up from there. People, for instance, will say, IITs were created, and yes, but IITs actually, those are areas of higher education where oftentimes the private sector doesn't come in. That's good, but it's not about these are sectors where basically government has business sort of going and investing, but private sector activity which let's say corporations can handle very well, there was no reason for that. So which is again an illustration of the broader point that areas where the government needs to to invest in, it often did not invest as much, and areas where it should not have gone into, it went into, and that's why we had the very dismal rate of growth up until 1991. Now, when as I was trying to explain, I was going to use the example of agriculture. We have this Essential Commodities Act that was passed in the 1960s, and that was a time when India actually suffered food shortages. Now, what does the Essential Commodities Act do? It basically says any storage is effectively hoarding, and whoever is basically storing can basically be labeled a hoarder and therefore can be punished. Now, I'm sure you might remember some of these movies from Bollywood movies where this guy was shown as basically as
Absolutely.
Now one of the fundamental things to actually think about, it's just plain common sense, right? Agriculture, the supply is seasonal.
Yes.
When the crop comes in, basically that's when you get the supply. Demand, on the other hand, is all through the year. If you have seasonal supply, there's a spike in supply, and demand is seasonal, you have to store. You have to store. I mean, it's just plain common sense. Now, yet we basically went and said all storage is hoarding, and as a result, the infrastructure that basically is required for, and this hurts especially small farmers, because a small farmer cannot basically go and put, let's say, in cold storage. He cannot put that money. He doesn't have. Rich farmers can can do it themselves. All these ways of actually unnecessary regulation has actually hurt the small farmer.
Yeah.
And that is true for not just agriculture but elsewhere as well. A lot of these, when government unnecessarily intervenes, it is the person who actually does not have access to corridors of power. The common person is the one that gets hurt the most. So in other words, it is really critical to dismantle some of these remnants of the socialist era to really benefit our common citizens. One more example from agriculture. Take the APMC Act. If you think about every other producer, that producer could be the producer of this coat, this blazer, your t-shirt, could be the producer of these, these infrastructure, cameras, etc. They all can go and sell their produce wherever they want.
Correct.
Is that freedom allowed to the farmer? Farmer is also a producer, is a producer of food?
Yes.
No. The APMC Act basically says that you can go and sell only in a particular. So for all the rhetoric that we have on farming, we in fact actually put the maximum amount of restrictions on farming, and needless restrictions, and thereby the state of the small farmer, the small marginal farmer, is basically not very good. And this is something, in fact, the farm bills actually were an effort to really help the small farmers. And I can tell you, I was so disappointed by the, and many intellectuals themselves who should have, and these were people who, when they were in August offices, wrote supporting the farm bills, and earlier chief economic advisors as well, who basically did not support, and I think which basically was very disappointing. I can tell you that if that had gone through, the small farmers lot would certainly would already by now have improved a bit and actually would have continued. So these are examples of how there is needless government intervention which needs to be dismantled if we really have to grow at 8% to become a developed economy by 2047.
Just on the agriculture piece, there is this constant narrative out there, including from people from, say, I don't know what to call it, the right wing or in economic terms, right side, if you like, that agriculture around the world is subsidized and that is how it is meant to be. Would you agree with that? I mean, is that how it is always going to be? That, and in that case, they defend actually that the farm laws are bad. You have to do MSPs and so on and so forth.
No, so I think, see, this is a much larger debate, of course. I think the fact does remain that advanced economies, for all the pontification they do to emerging economies, they actually subsidize agriculture, to a huge extent. There's no question, and it is in that context that this point is being made. But be that as it may, as I explained to you, there are areas where the economy and the citizens actually, especially our farmers, small and marginal farmers, can benefit, irrespective of whatever basically other countries are doing, and maybe they're suffering the damage out of that. Why don't we do what is actually beneficial, for us? And it's beneficial not just from an economic perspective, but even from a social and economic inclusion perspective too, because it will lead to, far more improvements in productivity in agriculture. It'll help, raise incomes. It's like right now we've been trying to, increase agricultural incomes with our hands and legs tied down, and, having to do Bharatnatyam, which actually is, so let's open up these hands and legs actually, and some of these very unnecessarily laws, we can dismantle them.
Final question, perhaps around crony capitalism. There is a lot of accusation made on, recently a friend of mine who's an ESG consultant actually said, Reliance has a lot of crony capitalism. Look at the prices of polyester, for example. They lobby with the government and so on and so forth. So, I mean, you've mentioned in one of the interviews that there was a lot of crony capitalism before 2014, 2004 to 14, which is why it led to NPAs and so on and so forth. How do you define this? What is crony capitalism really, and how do you think this government has changed the narrative and moved the needle?
So couple of things, right? Specifically on in the banking, context itself.
Yeah.
So as many people have talked about, before 2014, there used to be phone banking, which was basically specific. Now, if lending is happening just purely on the merit of the project, then the bank should be able to, on commercial terms, decide what it wants to do without any
phone call
diktats or phone calls actually from which has certainly been the case with this government. I'll give you a very specific example. During COVID, for instance, right? Now, even though this certainly there wouldn't have been any cronyism in this, because we could have easily said that, public sector banks go and lend to small firms, MSMEs, SMEs, go and lend. We could have given a diktat, right? But that would not have been necessarily, respecting their right to make commercial decisions. So instead, what did we do? We basically said, we will give you a first loss guarantee. In other words, and why is this guarantee important? Because people like you and me, we are well off, right? With COVID, our incomes were not impacted as badly.
Right.
But, urban poor, smaller firms, for them actually they suffered. And therefore, they would have had problems of liquidity, but they may also have had problems of solvency. And if based on a pure commercial decision, the bank may say, if I lend to this SME or MSME or maybe to this urban poor, I may, that loan may default, and I don't want to take that risk, right? And that's a pure commercial decision. Right. So what we said was, okay, we will overlay a guarantee. We will take the first, let's say first 10 rupees. Okay. If you've lent 100 rupees, first 10 rupees that basically gets lost on this, because this is in a distress period, we will underwrite that, we will take that loss as a government, basically. Okay. And so with that guarantee, then the bank was comfortable saying, but what we did also do was to leave enough skin in the game for the bank. We didn't say we will take all losses.
Choose where
you choose. Not just that, but if for instance in some loans, let's say there are losses, the losses are actually 15 rupees, then you take that $5. We will take the first loss, but you have to take after that, and therefore leaving enough skin in the game for the bank, so that it does its due diligence properly. But this was a case where actually the commercial decision, the right of the bank to make commercial decisions, was very well respected. Yeah. And this is the part actually, as I said, if for instance, there is a phone call that goes which says basically industrialist X is putting out project Y, and so bank Z needs to be, hey, whoever of bank Z you need to lend. That is actually, as you can see, I mean the example itself actually, it reeks of cronyism. Yeah. But when you on the other hand do it in this manner, then that is not something which is a. Now to basically the way you contextualize this question, let me also pose this. If you look at Apple's net worth in the US, Apple's net worth now has become some 3 trillion, right? And over a 20-year period, if you basically went back 20 years, Apple's net worth at that point I think might have been about 200 odd billion. So it's multiplied several times, like orders of magnitude, right? Or an order of magnitude. Now, has the US GDP multiplied by that much? Of course not, right? In other words, now using that same data, one could say, oh, Apple has been basically, the fact is that when the economy rises, there will be some firms, and without going into specific details, there will be some firms who may be more entrepreneurial, who may actually be more diligent, who may actually have better business model, who may have better execution capabilities, and they will benefit more, right? And I think now that is an important perspective to. That said though, let me actually also say the construct of actually wealth creation in a fair and square manner, I think is a very important construct actually, that not just countries like India, but countries like US and advanced economies, all of us need to keep in mind, because when competition is fair and square, I think, and we can take examples of the competitive examinations that we made it through. Those are all fair and square competitions, yeah. Right? And that enhanced capabilities. Correct. But if, for instance, let's say my father was whatever X, and basically say you just go and sit in the examination, your admission to IITs or IIM or whatever is, then obviously I wouldn't have worked hard, and that wouldn't have built up capability. So from the perspective of actually India at 100 and building those necessary capabilities, fair and square competition is absolutely important, and I will emphasize that definitely. Having already explained to you that we need to understand this in the right perspective.
Sorry, and that's a good segue into one last question is on income inequality, rising income inequality.
So these are few areas where we need to be careful about the Bollywood music syndrome in two decades back. If you would recall, many times some of these music producers, they'd basically listen to a nice jingle that basically someone in the US had, or maybe Hollywood had, and they would just plant Indian lyrics onto it, and we had a now of course that has gone down with a lot more globalization. But when it comes to many of these narratives, many of us still do this Bollywood exactly. And I think inequality is one very good example of that. Why? because in the advanced economies, you know, and I've covered that in great detail, if you correlate higher inequality with socio-economic indicators, what do you find? That higher inequality correlates with lower socio-economic indicators.
Okay.
In contrast, do the same thing, just replace that, you know, that the data instead of for the advanced economies for India, same variables, correlate with inequality, no correlation for India.
And very interestingly, you said, you know, Piketty is very often quoted.
Yes.
You said that he's quoting data out of context.
Yes, actually, you know,
or something like that.
Oh, yes, because, you know, he's sort of used tax return data, and, you know, the simple fact is, you know, population of 140, you know, 140 crores, about maybe 7-8 crores pay taxes.
Correct.
So from there, if you have to infer, you know, income of everybody else, you need heroic assumptions. And, you know, which, you know, I think which maybe in a Tollywood movie, actually, you know, one guy, you know, defeating like 100 people, you know, it happens in movies, but those kind of heroic assumptions actually make me really, you know, pose questions. And that's why we have to be careful, you know, in inferring what is being spoken about. We have to be careful in also not imputing some of this. As I said, the correlations are different, and therefore we have to contextualize these debates to India, and then understand. And also, the simple fact remains that you know, if you if you look at the data, consumption, you know, consumption inequality from 2011-12 to 2020-22-23, that 10-year period, you know, poverty as defined using the World Bank, you know, $1.9 purchasing power parity per capita per day line is basically a sort of technical term, just trying to be rigorous here. Some threshold for poverty which the World Bank defines. Basically, that number, poverty has declined 12.5% to 2.5%. You know, similarly, if you use the higher line, which is actually about $3.6, there also there's been significant decline, which tells us, and you know, and I think other countries, China, etc., are also good examples. India's own growth from 1991 is a good example that growth actually does lead to reduction in absolute poverty. So
even if it leads to income inequality, even if a few people have very large number of wealth and the rest are rising up along with them,
yes,
and that's okay,
because right now for a 140 crore population where we have still large numbers of people who need to be lifted up their levels, I think growth is really most important, and I think that is the aspect. See, you know, I think and I'll end with this, that we don't live in ideal worlds. We live in basically the real world, which has constraints where, and you know, an economist, and this is an essential part of economics, which is there are always trade-offs. The win-win that we talk about, everything great, is basically something that, you know, in a sort of a utopian scenario can happen. But therefore, the decision about good economics is to make choices here. Right now, the more important one is to actually elevate our, you know, population, especially to make sure that their incomes are increased, and for that growth is really critical. So bottom line, what I would say is that debates actually need to be contextualized to India. We need to, and common people need to, you know, really sort of question what even scholars say. And I actually, that's why I give you evidence, because I don't want the viewers to take me, basically the statements I make just on face value. Question me too. The whole point of education, what is the point of education, is where it makes you think critically. But if you are basically taking what I'm saying, just because, you know, I said it's a holy grail, then you're not using your education, and that is equally true for someone else as well. That someone else may be a very reputed scholar X or Y or Z, but question them too. You know, is the data that is being portrayed. We started with the very first question, you know, and I circled back to that actually, and I told you that that's an incomplete picture. This is something that our viewers need to really do. That's the whole point of education. And otherwise, actually, we are just being intellectual herds. You know, just herding. Somebody sets a first sheep, and everybody else is following that, and that's not what we want with educated
Indian
people.
civilization terms, if I may add this, that's a real difference between Abrahamic religions and Indian religions, if you like. Questioning everything.
The entire Upanishadic thought is about questioning. You know, and that is basically, it's a convent where the guru and the shishya is basically sitting. Shishya is asking questions, the guru is explaining. That is the essence of our civilization. So we need to get that spirit back actually. And you know, in other words, bottom line, what I want to is to don't equate the message to the messenger. You know, or said differently, which in one of my interviews during COVID, I had said this as well, that to use a cricket parallel, even Wasim Akram and Shane Warne bowled bad deliveries.
Yeah.
So, and as a batsman, Sachin Tendulkar didn't say, oh, just because, Wasim Akram is bowling, every ball is going to be great. No, if there was a bad ball, he hit it for 4. So, if a Wasim Akram or a Shane Warne can bowl bad deliveries, a scholar X or scholar Y can also give bad arguments, actually. And, therefore, arguments need to be evaluated. When you play cricket, you play the ball, you don't play the bowler. In a similar way, you play the message, not the messenger.
Very nice. That's a great learning for me as well, because to your point, we end up being in echo chambers where we want to hear only what our own views are said.
Yeah.
Very good. I'm going to ask you to end with one statement you made at the beginning before the recording, positive outcomes. For positive outcomes to manifest, would you like to say that, and then we'll end it?
Yeah, this is an aspect that I fundamentally believed in, which is that for positive outcomes to manifest, positive thinking is necessary. But for negative outcomes to manifest, negative thinking can often be sufficient. And in other words, therefore, positivity has to actually fight harder. Because there are enough and more who actually want to spread the negativity, and so this book is therefore an effort, and in a credible way. I'm not basically selling a dream here, but I'm with everything with logic, economic logic, data. But when there are positives, actually some of us need to highlight that, and others need to actually look at that and evaluate critically, and then believe whether this is indeed something that is credible or not.
Thank you very much. More
My
power
pleasure.
to you.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Hope you all enjoyed. Please leave your comments in the comment section, and hopefully he can find time to even respond. Let's see. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.